Chuck.
And this is Karen.
And this is our show,
What If It Really Works?
A Practical Guide to Spirituality. And Karen, who are we looking at right here?
Well, we're looking at a very special person, special to the world, but also very special to us. And that's Ken Heyman. And I'll let you tell about Ken because he's been your friend for so many years.
Well, Ken is a world-famous photographer. He has photographs hanging both in the Museum of Modern Art and the Smithsonian. He's written 41 books. He's had 156 assignments with
Life magazine.
With Life magazine. And he spent 20 years as Margaret Mead's personal traveling photographer. So, Ken, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So, let's start at the beginning.
In my home.
Let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved with Margaret Mead?
Well, I was a terrible student, and I got into Columbia College because my father and my brothers went there. But I got on scholastic probation because I was interested in photography and would take pictures for the school newspaper and rush to have it in the paper and then sleep through my morning classes. So I was put on scholastic probation, and during the Korean War, those people were drafted. When I got out of the Army, I decided I didn't want to take all those heavy contemporary civilization classes, and the most interesting person and the most famous person in the campus was Margaret Mead. So I got there, and it was a huge auditorium, about 500 people, and I was sitting way up in the last row. I'd only been in the Army like 2 weeks previous to this, and when I was let out in January, I was accepted immediately back at school. Actually, I was the first GI coming back after the Korean War. And this Dr. Mead came out, and she was a small person, sort of, and she began talking using her hands, no notes, and I was spellbound. And I realized part of it was that I was sitting, and there was a big loudspeaker right behind me, and it was like she's talking in my ear. But I signed up for the next class, and in the next class she said, with all you students here, I can't look at all the homework, but there's one piece of work. And at the time I was working in a Harlem settlement house, and she said a marvelous thing. She said, and if you're able to do photography and use it in your final paper. So I did it of this Harlem settlement house, and she, anyway, I got my first A, and she called me into his office, and she said she wanted me to take her graduate course. And so suddenly I said, I can't, I'm not a graduate. She said, don't be silly. Anyway, I took that, and then I went back further. I would talk about photography. I was getting my first few assignments from Life magazine. And then one time when I was up giving her class, we walked across campus, and she said to me, Ken, I'd like you to go to Bali with me. And it was such a big idea that I didn't hear her. And I called her the next morning, and I said, Dr. Mead, did you ask me to go to Bali with you? She said, yes, you didn't say anything, so I thought, oh no, I want to go. So she said, well, meet me in my office. Anyway, so we went to Bali about 6 months later, and that was a marvelous experience, a month in Bali with Margaret Mead. I learned more than I did through my whole college experience. And then later on, we did a very important book called Family, which is traveled all around the world, as many countries as possible, photographing family life. And I think that was the best teaching thing I ever had, because I had to learn how to go into the families, have people bathing and that sort of thing, and there was often an interpreter, but if I talked to the mother and I would say, baby, and she got the idea, and she would pick up her baby and bathe it, and that was the way. So that was how I met Margaret Mead. And I worked with her then for 20 years, going to Sicily and Mexico and some other places.
And there was just the two books that you published with her, or one?
Yeah, we did more. We did more than two books, but only two books were published. One was very successful, Family, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and sold over 250,000 copies. The other one didn't do well at all because Margaret Mead got in a fight with the publisher, and they refused to send out, in retaliation, they refused to send out copies to reviewers. So nobody knew about this book, and it didn't do well.
Wow. Wow. So what's the main thing you bring away from your work with Margaret Mead? What is the thing you learned that was most important?
Well, I think that she thinks about the world, looking at countries and how we all work together. And in that family book that I did, going into different families, and we're all families, we're all human. And it was, at that time, there was just in the early stages of television, so there wasn't a connection that we had. And so I felt that I was showing the world that we were all similar problems, similar families. And sometimes people ask me, well, you've photographed poverty, don't you feel sorry? No, I photograph, they're not so unhappy, the poorest people. They get along, they laugh, and that's the world that they know. And so what's the next question?
Go ahead.
One of the things that I've seen in the time that I've been married to Chuck is the memories that he has. Some of the best memories that he has are of the times that the two of you would sit beside one another out in a public place, and you would explain to him what was going on with the people around you, because you had learned from Margaret Mead about gestures, about how people relate to one another, and the looks and the movements. Would you share a little bit about that?
Well, even though I've done 41 books, the one that I'm most excited about is the one that is this book called Seeing Ourselves. And are you getting reflection?
No, that's good.
And it's about seeing and perception. And I've spent a lifetime, well, let me tell you how it began. I was 30 years old, and I was in Africa on assignment. And it was raining, I couldn't photograph. But I had a dream, and the dream was like life-changing dream that people have. And I realized that for me, school was all wrong, that they didn't teach anything about the way people live together. And for the next 2 days, the rain continued, and I wrote out what I would teach at a high school. I brought it back, and in New York City, the Dalton School is a very fine school, and my daughter had just been accepted, like she was in nursery or the first grade. And I showed it to the principal, and he read it over the weekend. He called me that was Friday, on a Monday he called me and he said he wants me to teach it. So I said, I can't, I don't have a graduate degree. He said, don't worry about that, but I want the school psychologist to sit in. It's a group of senior girls. That started my fascination in how people see and at that time perception, like the first assignment, well, not the first assignment, but after I got to know these girls, the principal said there are only two things these girls are interested in. I said, what's that? Boys and where they're going to go to college. Anyway, one of the first assignments I gave would be, I told them about Margaret Mead, and I said, who takes you into the village, which I learned from her, and that word is called the informant. It's the person, now if you go in with the bad guy, you'll get no work done, but if you go in with the priest or the mayor or the chief, you'll do well. Let me give you an example. Again, I was in Nigeria on a different trip, and I went to the back of the hotel, and they were all these strange taxis, and different old cars, and I spoke to the different drivers, and they said, and I found the one that spoke English, and I said, a better, at least understandable English, And he told me that he lives about 5 hours away, but he hadn't visited his family in 6 weeks. So I said, well, let's go there tomorrow. And because when I did this work with families, I didn't want the urban society. I wanted to get the culture of the country. So you want to be out there in a village that's less encumbered with what's going on in the world. So on the drive, he told me that his uncle was the village chief. So I said to him, well, when we arrive, take me immediately to your uncle, and you can go back with your wife and children all day. And the uncle was so pleased that the white man came. He said nobody had ever visited his village before. And so he spent the day showing me around. And when you're taken with this important person, everybody behaves properly, and I can take all kinds of intimate pictures of the family in the compound. And I did that pretty much all over the world, but it was a terrific lesson of how to work with people, even though you don't have a common language.
And when we are working with different cultures, if one of the things that we recognize is how there is a common thread that runs through them all.
Oh, yeah.
And we can recognize, then we're able to deal with people on a totally different level.
Yeah. I mean, you still have parents and children and trying to survive, but what people don't realize is that many of these starving people are also quite happy. I mean, they don't have the food or whatever all over, but they function, and they don't know about the way people live in other parts of the world. One time, there was one ceremony in Peru that was very exciting, and my wife Judy and I went to visit this terrific ceremony on a particular day, and we arrived there, and everybody was in church. And when they came out of the church, everybody was wearing tuxedos and lots of gold jewelry, and then the dancers were dressed like Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. And what had happened is that the old customs, CNN had arrived in that community, and they saw the modern world. So they didn't want to be old-fashioned anymore, and they wanted to be like the modern world, which is a shame, the way the world is changing. Many of these extraordinary cultures are just fading out.
And part of your job in this was to photograph them before they faded out. One of the things that, let's go back for a second, one of the things that Karen is fascinated with, and I've told her how fascinated I am, is that we can sit in a sidewalk restaurant in New York, like the farmer's friend of a farmer over on Irving Place, and as people walk by, you will explain who's in charge of that relationship and whatever. So, for example, when a guy walks by with a girl and he has his arm around her shoulder, what does that mean?
It means he's in control of that relationship. When the woman has her arm over the man, it usually means that it's a sexual relationship. But normally, it's the arm on top. And the way to tell this would be to look at your old family albums. And when you look, and you'll see Aunt Mary and Uncle Joe, and she has her arm over the guy for the picture. And that's when you have to see it. She would be in control of the relationship. And you could check it out, but it's almost always true. But I tend to do that. I read body language all the time. And what I'd like to talk about is that I've done a book about body language, which is this book, Seeing in Ourselves. And what I tell a group of people, I tell women that they know this, that they see more than men. And the reason that they see more than men is several. First of all, they spend more time looking at themselves, dressing in cosmetic, and when they were helping mom in the kitchen, and mom's on the phone, very often the conversation is, did you see? Did you see? Did you hear what they say? Did you see? So the little girl growing up wants to see what mama sees, and there's a basic learning there. The men tend to see their job or their hobby or their sport. They don't always see their family. Some do see their family, but many of them, the kids are running around and whatever has happened. Gay men see more than any other group. And you know this by all the professions that are like hairdressers and costume and stage design and onward, that they, when I moved years ago, when I moved into, down to Greenwich Village into the gay area, I was interested because I worked with Margaret Mead and had published a couple of books. So I saw that the Gay Society was an interesting society, and I'd studied it like I did with Margaret Mead looking at a village. And I found, actually, my nephew who's gay began explaining, and he introduced me to gays who wanted to talk about their gayness. And what I learned was that gay eye language is the most international language in the world. It's the only language that you can talk in every country. And the reason I learned it, or the way I learned it, was I met a man, a middle-aged man, quite handsome and wealthy, and after talking to him for about half an hour or so, he said, well, let me tell you my hobby. And I said, what's that? He said, I've been to 26 countries and making gay love in all these countries. And I said, well, how do you do that? Well, I'll give you an example. Let's say that I'm a gay man. Actually, I have 10 grandchildren, so I'm not. I'm a gay man sitting in a restaurant in the village, and I look at Chuck and I say, you're very handsome with my eyes. And he looks back at me, and so with his eyes he can say, and you are too. And I say with my eyes, oh, I'd like to meet you afterwards. I'd like to meet you sometimes. And he says, yes, I would do that. And then he says with his eyes, I'll meet you outside after lunch. He said, and then they say the most interesting thing is, he says with his eyes, I have to be in the power position. This is extremely important in a gay relationship, who's in the power position. So this man that went to all the countries, he arrives in a country, he doesn't speak the language, he knows, he can spot a gay, they spot each other very easily, and then he says, he knows that in every city there's a gay community. So he communicates he wants to visit the gay community, and then he scores. Now, I also interviewed all kinds of other people, like a dwarf, and what I had to do this for a magazine, and this dwarf had just won an Emmy, and he said the problem is that he goes into a store and he can't look over the counter, the man doesn't see him. Or in an elevator, he can't reach the buttons. Or children laugh at him and big dogs really bother him. And so he sees in this particular kind of way. I went to the lighthouse for blind people. And I spoke to this piano tuner who lives in New Jersey, and I asked him about what he sees. He says, well, I don't know. I said, on the way from my home in New Jersey to New York City, I passed 7 bridges, so I can tell, and each time we go over a bridge, it has a different rumble sound, so I know how close I am getting to the village. Then I met somebody who had an operation, that he was blind, and when he was 20 years old, he saw for the first time. And I said, well, what did you see? What was the biggest surprise? He said, trees. I said, why trees? He said, well, I knew they were round, hard things, but he said, when I could see them, they're so tall and majestic. He said, I love looking at trees in my family.
Wow. So you then, in this book, have addressed the subject of seeing in a different way. You're addressing how do we see more. Is that close to what you're trying to do?
Well, I talk about it, and the main point is that we all see differently. And I give examples. I found one time Time magazine assigned me to do a story on a kind of a sex house in New York. And the man was pleased to have the photographer there. We became good friends, and I did 26 interviews of him as he talked about his picking women up. And he was probably the world's master at reading women's, going into a party and looking at different women and with his eye contact, reading who. He said, you never go after the most beautiful, but you go after the middle one, and how he works it to see which one, and he'll go out, and he picks them up and goes out and makes love with them. And then I did a story on Newark, and I rode around with a Newark detective, and what he sees, what he looks for, the crime that he looks for. And I saw that what I call specialized visions, interviewed people of that sort.
This is an incredible book, Ken. You sent us a review copy, whenever you were putting it together. And it touches the heart and the soul of anybody who picks it up and looks at it. I believe
Hopefully, yes.
Yes, I believe it will. It certainly did mine. And I couldn't put it down. When we got it, I just sat immediately and just read all the way through it. And I mean, looked. It's just a very touching book.
And I show photographs, because that's what I do, to illustrate how my mood can change. Like, my very first book was a little boy called Willie who was in Hell's Kitchen. And this boy, his mother spoke Spanish, so he was not bilingual. He didn't speak English. So I was able to follow him around for 3 or 4 days as he jumped around and whatever it is. But I reacted so strongly to photograph him because as a child, I was never allowed to go out alone. I was always had to be watched for somebody who was with me. So to see his freedom of being, this whole block was like his home. Everybody in this street knew this little boy and would look after him. So I tried to illustrate how your lifetime experience influences what you see.
Yes, and right now, do you see that we are starting to come back to community where people are looking out for everybody else? What have you seen in the years?
No, I would disagree with that. I find people don't look out for anybody. There are marvelous stories on television where somebody does a miraculous thing and saves somebody's life, but basically people go around in their own world. What I'm very concerned about, and my purpose for the book, other than explaining the difference of seeing, is that the young people today are seeing far less than they did in past generations, because they're twittering, or they're walking around looking at this, even taking photographs. In my day, you look around with your eyes and you take a picture. Now people walk around looking at the back of the camera, and that's the way they see. So that I'm concerned in the future there will be far less perceptive. And I would say that's my end goal for this book.
Wow. So you said that you don't believe we're able to encompass a lot in terms of community. Everybody's sort of out for themselves. But what happened after 9/11 in New York? Did that change the way people saw each other?
Well, My wife Judy and I, we live in this loft here, and if you go to the back window, we can see the Twin Towers. And that morning we were watching the Today Show, and they said, we interrupt this program, and then you could see the plane hit. So we went to the back of the window and looked out, and we could see the smoke coming up, and I said, well, let's go downstairs. We got downstairs, and people said, get back in, there might be poison gas or something like that. And actually we bought something to seal up the windows. We never did, but so that attitude. And then the next thing that followed was a kind of fear. And the thing I noticed was the amount of foreign taxis suddenly had American flags on their, stuck in the windshield or on the side of the car. I think that fear was the primary thing, and that we could be damaged that way. And after a while, it dissipated to a large extent. And people are worried about the economy and all of that thing. But we just had an anniversary of 9/11, and it was very touching to watch every person. The families of the people that died gave a talk, and it was very touching. And I'm glad they're building the memorial thing down there. But as far as society, I'm not sure. I think we're basically, most of this country is isolationist and think about themselves and their lives and their economy, how much money they owe or losing their home and that sort of thing.
So the interesting part to us, Ken, is, because we're not here, we're in Texas, and in Texas it's more spacious, and yet we have a community of people who go out of their way to take care of each other, which I think is very,
Well, Austin, you live in Austin. Austin is not like the rest of Texas, as you well know.
Absolutely.
They're very, I would say, mostly liberal kind of thinking, and there's a fine university there. But other parts of Texas, maybe not so that everybody. I think people, you take care of your neighbor, but I don't think you take care of the stranger, unless the stranger's in real trouble and you're the kind of person that goes and does that.
So, when you're talking about seeing to people, let's suppose you were giving a college class tonight. Where would you start in trying to teach them how to see?
Well, one of the things I would say to young mothers or that have small children is, don't ask your child, what did you do today? I think that's a mistake. Ask them what did you see today? And because the child's mind, what did they do? They did all day full of things. If you say, what did you see today? They said, oh, Johnny got hurt, the ambulance came, or there's a new boy in class. They see specific things. And I think that's one of the most important ways to make your child more perceptive. Another thing, I think, in your baby's room, you don't have frightening things like a big scary clown. And I found the best humidifier in the world is a fish tank near the bed, which oxygenates the room, but also is a very pacifying thing for the child. And then always be interested in their little stories, which some parents are wonderful at and some are not, but to reinforce them of being perceptive. As far as an adult, I think once you read this book, you realize that you see only specific things in your life. If you're in, let's say you're in the garment industry, you'll see clothing all the time and say, well, maybe I'll try to see something else and make an effort in doing it. So there's lots of ways you can, I give other examples in the book of things that you might do to strengthen to see in a wider way. I want to say that in the beginning of the book, almost the first thing that you read, it says that looking is what we do all the time. Seeing is when we see something that we're looking at. Perception is taking that piece of information and using it. We look down the street, we might look at the traffic light changing, but that tells us what we have to do, stop or go. So that many people just go through the world looking at their Twitters and reading their messages. I'm very concerned about people driving cars and doing twittering away. But I think people can consciously learn more to see.
Mm-hmm. So, has television itself affected our seeing or our sight?
Well, when I was teaching the high school years ago, I'm 81 today, and this was back when I was 31, after I taught that first year of seeing, first of all, I taught a term, and then what happened was that in January, the principal called me into his office and said, the other half of the class that are jealous, and the parents want their children to take your class. So I taught that year. And then the following year, I said, just what you're saying is that I wanted to find out about how television influences the children. So I taught 6th grade for a year. And I did all kinds of games with the children in the 6th grade. For example, one of the things we did was we said, okay, I said, first of all, who are the architects and who are the artists and who are the whatever, and they raised their hands with the different professions and say, we're going to imagine that we're 20 years in the future and we're going to come back and look at what the school's called, at the Dalton block. And so let's see how we measure the block. And so I said the architects and the computer people we're going to pace off. I said, you don't have to measure, we'll talk about the paces. So find out how many paces for the whole block. And then each time you go to a different building, somebody makes a note of when that building begins and when the building ends. And then somebody with a Polaroid camera took a picture of the building. And then in the art department gave me one of these big brown rolls that was about 24 feet long. And we pinned it up on the wall in the hallway of the school. And they drew the block. And I had one group, I call them farmers. They had to go along the block, and I said, pick up anything that doesn't smell that you find. And that stuff was pinned to the bottom of the chart. And I guess the school liked it because they kept it up for the rest of the year. But it was another thing we did was I took 10 $1 bills and we hid them in the class, but not where, all of them you could see if you knew where to look. One was around the book covers, so it looked like part of the jacket of the book. One was in the kerchief in the teacher's breast pocket. One was in the state of Utah, just around there. One was in the fish tank around a rock on the bottom of the fish tank. And they were in different places that were not. The trouble with that was it was too exciting for the kids, and they would scream when they found one. But it was very successful in using your eyes to really look at things.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that is working against people seeing better? Is there?
Yes, the whole society with the cameras and their twittering they're not looking. I mean, I had to pull a girl out crossing the street, and she was doing this, and I had to pull her back for the car was coming, and it's really kind of dangerous the way everybody's. On the other hand, being in a big city, it's a safety thing. They could call 911 or call a friend or something like that, which is a big help. But most of it, when they're doing that, and if you walk along the street,
you see it everywhere.
Almost everybody is doing this thing.
Yeah, I was astounded. So many people are just walking down the street looking at a little screen while the whole world is going right in front of them.
Yeah. And today more photographs are taken than any time in history, because with the cell phone they're taking pictures. Everybody's got a camera, mostly with a cell phone photographs. And the new thing is they're taking a picture of themselves. They hold up like this with their girlfriend or something and take a picture. So it is changing.
Yeah, when you talk about holding a picture up like this, one of your books was called Hip Shot. And it was that was also very much about seeing. And as I recall, you ask yourself the question, if you had a third eye, where would you put it? Right?
Now, there's two different stories.
Oh, okay.
One is back with the sixth graders. I said, if you had a third eye, where would you put it? There's a right answer to this. So they went back and they told me next year. Most of them said in the middle of the forehead and that sort of thing. But the answer is in the middle of the palm of your hand, because you can look underneath things, you could look behind you, you can protect it. So that's where you'd want your third eye. Now, what was the other question?
Well, that began this book, Hip Shot.
Oh, okay. Some years ago, the day in the life of whatever was the day in the life of Canada, and I went with 100 photographers to do the whole country. And some of them had these little plastic cameras. And I asked an editor, what are these little cameras? Can you get around?
No.
And anyway, the editor said, buy one. The next week I bought one of these things called point and shoot cameras, and I put film in it, and I was driving down the avenue, and alongside of me a pickup truck with some cheering kids in the back. They had just won some game, and without thinking much, I took the camera out with my left hand, and I held it out the window and I snapped. And then when I brought it back, I said, I just took a picture. I didn't set the camera. I didn't focus. I just pushed a button. It must be automatic. So that following weekend, I live in Greenwich Village, and we walked around and I took pictures of all kinds of things. And in one photograph, the person in the foreground was gigantic, and somebody just a few steps behind them was miniature. And because I had the camera low. And then I realized when I saw that contact sheet, it was like Madame Curie saying, wow, I've never seen this. And at that point, I had seen hundreds of photography books and many picture magazines, and I never saw that perception before of that distortion. And so for the next year, I would go around doing that, and most of the pictures I found it was much more effective when I had the camera on the ground and have it low. For example, if you take this point and shoot camera, and you have a child or a dog, and you put the camera on the ground and tilt it slightly and take a picture, that person will be much larger and bigger and more important in the image. And I suggest people who see this program would do that, and they'll have a lot of fun making interesting portraits of their children or their dogs.
So, what happens when you begin to see differently? How does it affect you? How is a person...
I don't think it happens all at once.
But what happens when somebody begins to see differently?
Well, one of the things, there have been a lot of books written about seeing, but 90% of them are looking at art and interpreting the artist. And very few books talk about the kind of thing that I'm talking about, is how You know, when we go to a supermarket, why are all the candy things on a low level? Because when mama pushes the cart, the children see all these delicious things. They say, I want that, mommy, I want that. That's the perception of how the supermarkets are affecting what the kids, and I think the overweightness of the nation is due to this good stuff and the lower things that mommy has to go past. I think learning how to see, certainly in an art class, it's if you have a good art teacher and putting up or a live model or something like that, but a good teacher can tell them and help them along. And one of the things, if you know all about art, that you know that there's so many different ways of looking that the artists have. And some of them, I don't know that all artists see very well. They see the way, the style of their pictures. So an abstract colorist might not see very well, but he knows how to spread those colors around in interesting projects. Jackson Pollock would have the big canvas on the ground and it's now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars.
That brings up a next interesting part of your career. I guess as a result of a Life magazine assignment, you began photographing artists. Is that correct?
Well, artists my two favorite subjects are artists and exotic cultures, you know, where people live very simply and so forth. But as far as photographing artists, one time I was at a party and I met Andy Warhol. And the hostess called the next day and said, you know, he could use some help. So Andy Warhol came over to my place. He was carrying these big Altman shoe ads. And I didn't know, this young artist was very strange, white hair. And I said, well, what can you do? He said, well, I can paint a room. So we went around and we found a bathroom. At that time, when I was just starting, and I thought I could photograph models, and this was sort of the dressing room for the model agency, the model pictures. So I came back that day, and he painted a tree on the top of the wall, and he would take a rubber stamp, and he would put leaves on the tree with a rubber stamp, and then he had another one with cherries, and he would put cherries all over on the tree, and then he had a butterfly one, and he would put butterflies all over the wall, and then he would take a brush and just swash them with color, and then he painted a calico cat on the floor and a calico cat on the toilet seat, and for $400. And it's amazing because now, I think recently he sold a painting for $42 million. And some years later, I got a phone call. At that point, I'd done about 5 or 6 books, maybe more. And a publisher said, would you be interested in photographing pop art? And I was busy as a photojournalist, and I said, what is pop art? And then they mentioned, and among the 5 artists that I would concentrate on, one was Andy Warhol. So I called Andy, and I said, Andy, we're going to do a book on pop art, and you have a whole chapter. Oh, good. And then he said, where should we start? Oh, how about Lutece? And Lutece is the most expensive restaurant. I said, there's a $300 budget for your chapter with film and processing. Oh, all right. Let's go to 42nd Street and I could get lost in the crowd. I said, no, Andy, that's not very good. Oh, all right. How about sitting on my silver throne? I said, that's exactly where we start. So I went to his loft, which was all painted silver. And his silver throne they had built out from the wall, was his toilet. And it was all a silver toilet. And he sat there, and that was the first picture. And then on the floor, there was all these boxes of Brillo and Campbell's soup things. And anyway, when I do a portrait like that, I worked 3 days. The first day I'm sort of being kind and listen, and the second day I worked very hard, and the third day I finish what's missing. But Andy Warhol, I've photographed, the book I'm doing is 100 celebrities. Not published, but I've finished it this summer. And Andy Warhol, by far, of all these people, he was the best subject to photograph because he was able to place himself in the composition. He would look at a thing and he would put himself and make a wonderful photograph. And very few people do that. Some give me a hard time and don't want to be photographed. Some like B.F. Skinner, a professor up at Cambridge, and he was like, you could sort of put him where his mind was someplace else. And what I described the way it was like he was in a barber shop and let the barber do whatever. He was sort of, his mind just wasn't with us. He was thinking about his philosophy and that sort of thing. Yes?
So you also had a couple of really famous photo assignments, and one of them happened, I believe, in Egypt with Elizabeth.
Oh, that wasn't in Egypt.
Okay, talk to us.
I was asked to do Elizabeth Taylor for Cleopatra. And it was actually filmed outside of Rome in Cinecittà, which is the Hollywood of Italy. And I got there, and it was a big deal because
Keep going.
okay. Because I lost my thought. Well, nobody had seen Elizabeth Taylor. She had had a tracheotomy, and the world wanted to know about that. And I photographed the sets, and she was with Eddie Fisher at the time. She hadn't, and anyway, I photographed her, and fortunately one of the photographs I took was her favorite picture, and she had it life-size at a dressing room the whole time. After the film came out, a few months later, I got a call from some gruff voice, and they said, "Are you the photographer that the picture of Elizabeth?" And I said, "Yeah." Said, "Well, would you come to our office?" And where the office was in the garment section. It wasn't in the usual magazine world or whatever it was. And I walked in, and it was very overdone with lots of tapestries and things. And there were 3 men in black suit and cufflinks, and I kind of knew that they were mafia. And the big one sat straight ahead, and the 2 guys on the side. And I sat in this chair, wondering what was going on. And he said, "Well," he said, "Are you the photographer that took a picture of Elizabeth that she likes?" I said, and he described it. I said, "Yes." "Well, we're buying a whole issue of Life magazine, and we'd like you to be in charge of that. You'll be the editor." And I'm sitting there like, "What?" and he said, "We're going to give you $100,000, and that's for all your expenses. You keep whatever's left over. And Elizabeth's going to cooperate. And one of the things she's agreed to do is she's going to pose for Borden in a plastic or glass bathtub filled with milk, and she'll be nude. And there'll be other stories." So I couldn't believe it, and by the time I left, I said, "Yeah, this is really happening." And I went to see if I was going to do the photojournalism part, and I got in touch with a well-known fashion photographer to do the Elizabeth Taylor in the bathtub shot because he would do that better. And a phone call about, at least a month later, maybe 2 months later, "I'm sorry, the whole project is off because Eddie Fisher and Elizabeth have parted ways, and part of their agreement is that anything she profits, so she won't give him a penny. So the whole project was over. But that's my end of my Elizabeth Taylor story.
There's another famous event that you were involved with, and that was the funeral of President Kennedy. And you were able to get some shots that nobody else did because of your ability to see differently, right?
No, I wouldn't say that. When there's certain events happen, for example, like when Woodstock happened, I wanted to go there finally after I heard in the radio every day about these zillions of people gathering up there. And I finally went up there and I took the picture, but I didn't want to photograph for a magazine. I sort of wanted to do for myself. And the same thing happened with the Kennedy funeral. When he died, when he shot, and there was a funeral, I decided to go down to Washington, but I didn't get a magazine assignment. I sort of wanted to move around. You're much freer when you're on your own if the event is happening. And I arrived at Pennsylvania Station. I remember walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, and what was the strangest sight, I could still see it, everybody with these blank stares in their face, like in shock. Mm-hmm. The only other time I saw that was when John Lennon was killed. And the next day I went over to the park and I saw that same blank look. So by the time I got to the cathedral where the funeral was going, all the press had gone in there, and the press stand outside of the entrance was empty. And there was a guard there, but he wasn't paying attention, so I walked up and sat in the front there, and when they came out, I got a photograph of Jackie and the kids, and with the coffin coming. And actually, when Jackie died, that was in Newsweek. That was the double-page spread that they showed at the beginning of the Jackie Onassis piece. Yes.
Wow. So, with all of your experience and your world travel and your assignments with Life magazine and your 41 books and working with Margaret Mead,
It's too much.
that's enough. But with all of that, has your consciousness changed? Do you have a different connection with consciousness than you had 40 years ago?
No, I think what happens, that if anything, I'm not as concerned with the world as with the seeing book at the moment, with looking at people and reading people, that I don't, even though I go through the New York Times very quickly, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I just look for the interesting things, and I can't worry about the Near East as much as I used to, for example. As you get older, an artist sees his world. It doesn't get wider. It maybe does more intensifies.
And so you become even more hypercritical at what you look at? Is that what you're saying?
No, I wouldn't say hypercritical. I sort of read it, and it's interesting to me. But I wouldn't say I'm critical.
What's the strangest thing you ever saw?
Well, I've been asked what is the most interesting thing to photograph, and that's in India, in Varanasi. There's, they call them what, ghats. There's stone steps on one side of this river, and on the other side there's nothing. It's empty, but you can rent basically a rowboat, this guy, and it takes you alongside. And there, as you go past this scene, you see life, you see funerals, you see people bathing, you see, it's like the whole world passes you by. And if you're a photographer, you can just sit in a boat and take pictures of all these people doing all these things. And I think that's the most interesting thing in the world for me to see that kind of activity.
And your overall impression of India is?
Well, I've been to India 10 times. It's my favorite country because, I mean, for example, one time for Holiday magazine, I had to photograph religions of India. Now, India has more religions, more than a dozen, and so to find the Parsis, which they say, well, we'll wait for the birds come down and eat the bodies that are on the rooftops, or they have all kinds of interesting kinds of things, and I find that actually people say, well, how much has India changed? And there's a word immediately is traffic. That everybody has gotten, well, they have a lot of people on motorcycles now. So the few traffic lights that they have, we stop and we're all lined up on one side and they're all lined up, and then the traffic light changes and everybody goes, and it's like this, and it's pretty dangerous. And traffic there is just terrible in the big cities.
Mm-hmm. Ken, we want to let the reader know again, but you hold up the book and let them see it. The title of the book is Seeing Ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's in the process of production.
Well, what's happening at the printer now, I tell you, I've had bad luck with literary agents. I'm not a fan of them. And one turned me down. And I decided to, I have the list of 9 publishers that would publish books with photographs. And in the next week, I'm sending out 9 copies of this book to the managing editor of these publishers. And somebody's going to like it and go with it. And my fantasy is that maybe they'll have a bidding war, which was like one of my, oh God, that would be great.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah.
That's like, that's a wonderful, wonderful vision to hold. So what we want to let the viewer know is that this book is in process, and if you put your positive energy into what Ken's doing, it might have an effect on the outcome of this book.
That'd be great.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you all.
So Ken, this comes to the time when we're going to end this. Is there anything else you'd like to let the viewer know?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it was just my wife, Judy, and I had just came back yesterday from California, 2 days ago, and visiting. I have 5 children and 10 grandchildren, and just visiting different ones. One is a gay man with his partner, and they adopted 2 kids, and staying with them up in Oakland, it was just the most wonderful experience of everything. It's like the best kind of family that there was. And then on the other hand, we went to my daughter's home, and she's fortunate enough to have, her husband is the president of Warner Brothers. So they had a birthday party. It was like a big, I've never seen a birthday party like California, big Hollywood style. And that was extraordinary. And it was just nice to come back home and just relax.
Exactly.
So thank you for interviewing me and everybody out there.
And
It's been
Go ahead.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Ken, for allowing us to have this time with you.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
It's really been wonderful. Very good.
All right.